Today, I want to share with you a story from my childhood that I have never told anyone before. It's a story that shaped who I became and taught me that sometimes the most unexpected angels come into our lives when we need them most. I was only 12 years old when my father passed away from a sudden illness. My mother was left alone with 3 children and no source of income. Those were the darkest days of our lives. We had barely enough food to eat and struggled to pay rent for our small house. Within 6 months of my father's death, my mother made a decision that would change my life forever. A widower from the next village had proposed to her, promising to take care of our family. My mother, desperate and overwhelmed, accepted his proposal thinking it would solve our problems. But this man turned out to be nothing like what he had promised. He was kind to my mother in front of others, but behind closed doors, he treated us children like unwanted burdens. He had 2 children of his own from his first marriage, and it was clear that he favored them over us. The house became divided into 2 families. His children got the better food, better clothes, and better treatment. My siblings and I were treated like servants in our own home. We were given the leftover food after everyone else had eaten, and we had to do most of the household chores. As months passed, his true nature became more apparent. He started beating us for small mistakes and would lock us in a room for hours as punishment. My mother tried to protect us, but she was caught between keeping her new marriage intact and defending her children. When I turned 14, things reached a breaking point. One evening, I accidentally broke a plate while washing dishes. My stepfather flew into a rage and beat me so severely that I couldn't walk properly for days. That night, as I lay in pain, I made a decision that would change my life forever. I decided to run away from home and find work in the city. I had heard that wealthy families in the city hired young girls as house servants, and I thought this would be better than the torture I was enduring at home. At 14, I felt like I had no other choice. Early one morning, before anyone woke up, I packed my few belongings in a small cloth bundle and left home. I had saved a few coins over the months by doing small jobs for neighbors, barely enough for bus fare to the city. As the bus pulled away from my village, I watched my childhood disappear forever. The city was overwhelming for a village girl like me. The noise, the crowds, the tall buildings. Everything was so different from the quiet life I had known. I spent the first day wandering around, asking people if they knew anyone who needed a house servant. By evening, I was tired, hungry, and scared. I had nowhere to sleep and very little money left. I sat in a park, crying and wondering if I had made a terrible mistake by leaving home. Just when I felt completely hopeless, an older woman approached me. She asked why I was crying and where my parents were. When I told her my story, she offered to take me to her employer's house. She said they were looking for someone to help with household work and that they were good people who would treat me fairly. The house was like nothing I had ever seen before. It was huge, with beautiful furniture, paintings on the walls, and servants' quarters that were cleaner than any house I had lived in. The lady of the house interviewed me and decided to hire me on the spot. At first, everything seemed perfect. I had my own small room, regular meals, and work that wasn't too difficult. I was responsible for cleaning, helping in the kitchen, and taking care of the family's young children. The pay wasn't much, but it was more money than I had ever had in my life. The master of the house was a kind man who treated all servants with respect. He would often ask about our well-being and made sure we had proper food and rest. His children were well-behaved and polite to everyone in the household, but the lady of the house was a completely different person when her husband wasn't around. She was cruel, demanding, and seemed to enjoy making the servants suffer. She would find faults in everything we did and punish us harshly for the smallest mistakes. She had a particular dislike for me, perhaps because I was the youngest servant in the house. She would make me work extra hours, give me the most difficult tasks, and often made me go without meals as punishment for imaginary mistakes. I endured this treatment for months because I had nowhere else to go. I sent most of my earnings to my mother, keeping only a small amount for my basic needs. Despite the harsh treatment, I was grateful to have shelter and food, which was more than I had at my stepfather's house. One winter night, something happened that would change the course of my life forever. I had been working since early morning and was exhausted. While serving tea to the lady's guests, I accidentally spilled a few drops on her expensive carpet. She flew into a rage in front of her guests, screaming at me and calling me worthless and clumsy. In her anger, she slapped me so hard that I fell to the ground. The humiliation in front of the guests was more painful than the physical blow. But that wasn't the end of it. After the guests left, she continued to berate me, saying that I was ungrateful and didn't deserve the shelter and food she provided. In her fury, she declared that she had had enough of me and ordered me to pack my things and leave immediately. It was a cold winter night, and I had nowhere to go. I begged her to let me stay until morning, promising to work harder and be more careful. But she was unmoved by my pleas. She literally threw my belongings out of the house and slammed the door behind me. I found myself on the streets of an unfamiliar city in the middle of winter with no money, no shelter, and no one to turn to. I walked around aimlessly, looking for somewhere warm to spend the night. Most shops were closed, and the few people on the streets looked at me with suspicion. As I wandered through the empty streets, shivering from cold and fear, I came across a small alley where I saw someone sitting under a torn blanket. As I got closer, I realized it was an old beggar man who had made a shelter from cardboard and old clothes. He looked up at me with kind eyes and asked what a young girl was doing on the streets at this hour. When I told him what had happened, he moved over and offered to share his makeshift shelter. He said that the streets were dangerous for a young girl alone and that I should stay close to him for safety. This old man, who had nothing but the torn clothes on his back, shared his meager meal with me and gave me part of his blanket to keep warm. He told me his name was Abdullah, uncle, and that he had been living on the streets for several years. As we sat in that cold alley, sharing warmth and a simple meal of stale bread, he began to tell me about life. He said that sometimes life tests us in ways we never expect, but these tests are meant to make us stronger. He told me that every ending is also a new beginning. What surprised me most was how educated and wise this old man was. Despite living as a beggar, he spoke with the wisdom of someone who had seen much of life. He told me stories of great people who had faced tremendous hardships before achieving success. Over the next few days, Abdullah uncle took care of me like I was his own granddaughter. He showed me safe places to sleep, taught me how to find food, and most importantly, he started teaching me to read and write. He said that education was the only treasure that no one could ever steal from me. I learned that Abdullah uncle had once been a school teacher before. Illness and unfortunate circumstances brought him to the streets. Despite his current situation, he still carried old books in his bag and would spend hours teaching me letters and numbers. Days turned into weeks, and weeks turned into months. Under his guidance, I not only learned to read and write but also gained confidence and wisdom. He taught me about honesty, hard work, and the importance of never losing hope no matter how difficult life becomes. Abdullah uncle had a way of finding hope in the darkest situations. Even when we went days without proper food, he would smile and say that better days were coming. His faith and optimism began to influence me, and I started believing that my life could change for the better. One day, Abdullah uncle fell seriously ill. He had been coughing for weeks, but that day he could barely stand up. I used the few coins we had managed to collect to buy him medicine, but his condition continued to worsen. As he lay weak and struggling to breathe, he called me close and whispered something that I will never forget. He said that he had something important to show me before he died, something that would change my life forever. With great effort, he led me to an old abandoned building where we sometimes sought shelter. In a corner of that building, hidden under loose bricks, was a small metal box. With trembling hands, Abdullah uncle opened it to reveal more money than I had ever seen in my life. There were old currency notes, some gold coins, and important-looking papers. He explained that this was his life savings from his years as a teacher, money he had saved for his retirement but never got to use. He had hidden it here when he first became homeless, always hoping that someday he would be able to return to a normal life. With tears in his eyes, he told me that he wanted me to have this money. He said that I reminded him of the daughter he never had, and that he knew I would use this money wisely to build a better life for myself. That night, Abdullah uncle passed away peacefully in his sleep. I sat beside him until morning, crying for the loss of the only person who had truly cared for me since my father's death. He had been more than a guardian to me. He had been my teacher, my protector, and my hope. That night, Abdullah uncle passed away peacefully in his sleep. I sat beside him until morning, crying for the loss of the only person who had truly cared for me since my father's death. He had been more than a guardian to me. He had been my teacher, my protector, and my hope. With the help of some kind people from a nearby mosque, we arranged for his proper burial. I was the only one who mourned for him, but I made sure he was laid to rest with dignity. As I stood by his grave, I promised him that I would use his gift wisely and make something meaningful of my life. The money Abdullah uncle had left me was substantial enough to change my circumstances completely, but I was smart enough to know that I needed to use it carefully and plan for my future. I was still just 15 years old, but the hardships I had endured had made me mature beyond my years. I used a small portion of the money to rent a tiny room in a decent neighborhood and buy some proper clothes. For the first time in months, I had a safe place to sleep and didn't have to worry about where my next meal would come from. But I knew this money wouldn't last forever unless I found a way to make it grow. I spent weeks thinking about what kind of work I could do. I had learned to read and write thanks to Abdullah uncle, but I still lacked formal education. However, I had noticed that many women in the city needed someone to help with sewing and embroidery work, especially for wedding preparations and festivals. I used part of Abdullah uncle's money to buy a good sewing machine and quality threads and fabrics. I started taking orders for simple alterations and gradually moved on to making complete outfits. My work was neat and reasonably priced, so word spread quickly about the young seamstress who did excellent work. Within a few months, I had built a small but steady clientele. Women would bring me their old clothes to alter, order new outfits for special occasions, and recommend my services to their friends and relatives. I was earning enough to cover my expenses and still save money for the future. As my sewing business grew, I started thinking about expanding. I rented a slightly larger space that could serve as both my workshop and living quarters. I bought additional equipment and started taking on bigger orders like wedding, trousseaux, and festival collections. By the time I turned 17, I had established myself as a skilled seamstress with a good reputation. I had also managed to save a considerable amount of money by living simply and reinvesting most of my earnings back into the business. Abdullah uncle's initial gift had multiplied several times over through hard work and careful planning. It was around this time that marriage proposals started coming for me. Word had spread that I was a hardworking, independent young woman who had built her own business. Several families approached me with proposals from their sons, but I was selective about whom I would consider. I eventually agreed to marry a kind man who worked as a clerk in a government office. He was impressed by my independence and business acumen, and he promised to support my work even after marriage. He came from a modest but respectable family, and most importantly, he treated me with respect and kindness. Our wedding was simple but beautiful. I used my own savings to pay for my wedding expenses, which made me feel proud and independent. After marriage, I continued my sewing business, and my husband helped me expand it further by handling the financial side of things. Within 2 years of marriage, we had saved enough money to buy a small house of our own. We also had our first child, a son who became the light of our lives. I managed to balance motherhood with my business, often working while my baby slept beside me. Life was finally good. I had a loving husband, a healthy child, a successful business, and financial security. Sometimes I would think back to those dark days on the streets and marvel at how much my life had changed. I never forgot the lessons Abdullah uncle had taught me about perseverance and hope. As years passed, our family grew with 2 more children, and my business expanded into a small tailoring shop with 3 employees. my husband got promoted at his job, and we were able to provide our children with good education and comfortable living conditions. I made sure to teach my children the value of hard work and independence. I told them stories about the importance of education and treating everyone with respect, regardless of their social status. I wanted them to understand that success comes through honest effort and determination. When my children grew up and got married, I became a grandmother. Holding my first grandchild brought back memories of my own difficult childhood and made me grateful for how far I had come. I promised myself that my grandchildren would never have to face the hardships I had endured, but it was only when I was in my 60s that I discovered the most shocking truth about my past. I was going through some old papers that Abdullah uncle had left with the money when I found a faded photograph and some documents that revealed something incredible. The photograph showed a much younger Abdullah uncle with a woman and a small child. The documents indicated that he had once lived in my village and had worked as a teacher in the same school my father had attended. As I studied the papers more carefully, pieces of a puzzle began to fall into place. I realized that Abdullah uncle was not just a random stranger who had helped me. He was actually my grandfather, my father's father, who had disappeared from our family when my father was still young. The family had always believed he had died or abandoned them, but the truth was that he had fallen ill and lost his memory for several years. By the time his memory returned, he was too ashamed of his condition to return to his family. He had been living on the streets, trying to find a way to rebuild his life. When he met me that cold winter night, something about me had reminded him of his lost family, though he couldn't quite place why. The documents revealed that he had gradually remembered who I was during the months we spent together. He had recognized me as his own granddaughter, but was too ashamed to reveal the truth. He was afraid that I would be horrified to learn that my guardian was actually my own grandfather living as a beggar. This revelation explained why he had been so kind to me, why he had shared his life savings with me, and why he had called me the daughter he never had. He had been watching over his own granddaughter, giving her the love and support she needed to survive and thrive. I cried for days after this discovery, overwhelmed by a mixture of grief and gratitude. I grieved for the years our family had lost, for the grandfather I had known but not recognized, but I was also grateful for his protection and guidance. During the most difficult period of my life, I visited his grave and told him that I finally knew who he was. I thanked him for saving my life and for the love he had shown me even when I didn't know he was family. I promised to honor his memory by continuing to work hard and help others whenever possible. Looking back now, I realize that my life story is full of unexpected twists and divine interventions. What seemed like the worst misfortunes often led to the greatest blessings. Being thrown out of my stepfather's house led me to the city. Being fired from my job led me to Abdullah uncle. His death led me to independence and success. I have learned that life has a way of testing us through hardship, but it also has a way of sending help when we need it most. Sometimes that help comes from the most unexpected sources, and sometimes the people who mean the most to us are closer than we realize. Today, as I share this story with you, I want you to remember that no matter how dark your current situation seems, there is always hope for a better tomorrow. Every ending is also a new beginning, and every challenge is an opportunity to become stronger. Never lose faith in the power of hard work, honesty, and perseverance. Be kind to everyone you meet because you never know when someone might be an angel in disguise. And always remember that the greatest treasures in life are not material wealth, but the love, wisdom, and memories we share with those who care about us. My grandfather Abdullah uncle may have lived as a beggar, but he died knowing that he had saved his granddaughter and given her the tools to build a successful life. That knowledge was worth more than any treasure he could have left behind. This is my story, a story of loss and discovery, of hardship and triumph, of love that transcends recognition. I hope it inspires you to never give up on your dreams, no matter how impossible they might seem.